Morning, everyone. Nice to see everything in person and not in scrubs. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eli Adachi, who is a very distinguished alum of Tufts, and he's presently a tenured professor at the medical school at the Warren Alpert at Brown University. He served as the 5th Dean of Medicine and Biological Sciences at Brown University. He's a distinguished medical alumnus also of Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and a member of the National Academy of Medicine, New York Academy of Sciences, and the Association of American Physicians. He served as examiner and director of the Division of REI of the American Board of OBGYN. He's authored close to 900 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters in general areas of reproductive medicine, public health, and bioethics. So my pleasure to introduce Dr. Adachi.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? I'm tempted to say it's good to be home. I was here with Dr. Michael with sitting in the second row between, believe it or not, 1974 and 1977. And if you do the math, it's really, I don't believe about the life and for whoever else survives. And I will try to give you an account, a very brief account of our experience at the time. The chair of this department at the time was George Mitchell, who was a product of Johns Hopkins, at the time chaired by Richard Stellini, whose legacy in central gynecology, I think, is well known. I was also privileged to deliver the 1996 George Mitchell lectureship here on the George Mitchell Day, and to see Dr. Mitchell for the last time face-to-face in 2011 during a visit to San Antonio. Another dominant person of the era, who is still with us, thankfully, is Dr. Kennison, who was residency program director at the time. Some of you may know him. Martin Farber was one of our reproductive endocrinologists at the time. He still lives in this area in Western Massachusetts. And unfortunately, we lost another reproductive endocrinologist, Dr. Nuray Turksoy Marcos, who passed away about 5 years ago. I already introduced Dr. Michaelwitz, who was a year ahead of me in the residency. And this is something you don't shake, as you know. And when you graduate, those of you who are residents, and you reflect back on where you came from, this is the kind of involvement that stays with you for the rest of your life. Although we will be speaking today about the future, which is to say in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG for short, we need to remember that this is happening against the backdrop of what's going on today, which is IVF. And it's helpful to remember that IVF is going to turn 50 years old in 2027 or 2028, having been conceptualized and made possible by several people, but the leading principle being Bob Edwards. Of course, you remember Louise Joy Brown, who was born now almost 50 years ago, but that's how she looked in 1978. And Bob Edwards did receive the Nobel Prize in 2010 for this discovery. And you may ask yourself, why was Edwards singled out? Why didn't his collaborators receive the Nobel Prize as well? And unfortunately, the reason is a common and sad one. His two collaborators, Dr. Patrick Steptoe and Jean Purdy, simply, quote unquote, passed away prior to that time. And it is the policy of the Nobel Prize Committee to award the Nobel Prize only to living recipients. Edwards himself ended up passing away in 2012, 2013. This is the obituary which ran in the Lancet shortly after his passing. In the United States, we were lagging by about 3 years. The team that started IVF in the US was located in Norfolk at the time. And ultimately, on December the 28th, 81, the first baby was born in the US. We're talking about Elizabeth Jordan Carr, who was the first American IVF baby, who's shown here on the page of the Boston Globe, Life magazine, and others. I might add that her mother was and remains a citizen of Boston. She's somebody I know well. She's somebody I interviewed on more than one occasion. This was a remarkable story, but nevertheless, 3 years delayed after the original discovery. And as I said, we will focus today on the future, specifically on in vitro mutagenesis. Now, everything has a beginning, although it's a little difficult to pinpoint when IVG really got underway. But what we can say is that from the very beginning to this day, the principles who made it possible, who still are the leading principles in this arena, are Michinori Saito from Kyoto University and Katsuhiko Hayashi from Kyushu University. For reasons I will discuss, no relevant research is presently transpiring in the US. These two highly capable individuals drew my attention as far back as 2010 or so. And upon a visit to Japan, which had nothing to do with this, I booked a flight to Kyoto and spent half a day with these two gentlemen, only to be floored, only to be realized that I was staring at the future. Of course, this is still ongoing. It hasn't happened. It may take a good few years before it becomes a reality. But IVG is the next big thing after IVF. More importantly, perhaps, the principle that undergirds IVG, which is a much broader principle, that is to say, taking a stem cell and making any desired cell type out of it, is going to be a central feature of your time. By that I mean the young members of the audience. I'll give you one example of that, which will, I think, convince you of the veracity of this statement. Now, as is always the case when scientific endeavor is undertaken, you started in the rodent and you proceed gradually, when it's appropriate and safe, to the human counterpart. None of this would have been possible were it not for the notion of stem cell. And of course, the very term denotes what these cells are about. They can become anything. They can become an egg, they can become a sperm, which is IVG. But they can become a neural cell, they can become a gastric cell, they can become anything you wish if you know the recipe that it takes to get to there. And we happen to know more or less the recipe it takes to take a stem cell and convert it into an egg and convert it into a sperm. In the rodent, we are still struggling with the human. But for example, what if we were dealing with a patient who was lacking mammary neurons in the retina? If we could produce those, we could potentially cure the difficulty. What about an individual who is suffering from Parkinson's disease and lacks dopaminergic neurons? Could we potentially replace those in the striatum? And what about motor neurons? Individuals who may be paralyzed because of the lack of motor neurons in their spinal column, which is exactly where the first breakthrough seems to have occurred. Nature magazine, this very year, on the 24th of March, published a paper, Paralyzed Man Stands Again After Receiving Reprogrammed Stem Cells, which is another way of saying, using stem cells, neurons were produced and transplanted at an appropriate site in the spinal column, and in so doing, allowed this individual who was otherwise unable to walk again. So I think you can all appreciate the power of this technology and what the future holds in terms of future discovery. This is nothing short of stunning. I would not have predicted it. I would not have predicted that I would see any of this, anything like this in my lifetime. But what we will focus on today, of course, is stem cell-derived gametes. The importance of this can, in part, be deduced from the fact that Science magazine, which doesn't publish everything or anything, saw fit to dedicate a whole spread to in vitro gametogenesis back in 2021, authored, as you can imagine, by the two principles I introduced to you earlier. The New England Journal of Medicine, not to be outdone, proceeded to commission a similar paper from Mary Herbert and Nazim Surani in the UK, and published a paper titled Oocytes from Stem Cell. Another telling sign is the fact that the National Academy of Medicine, at my prodding and under my leadership, convened a workshop in 2023, wherein 2.5 days were dedicated in Washington, D.C., purely to the discussion of in vitro gametogenesis and the potential thereof. You might also want to take note of the fact that the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which is the premier bioethical institute in the UK, when it defines its agenda in human reproduction, it places in vitro derived gametes at the top of the list. Attesting yet again to the fact that a seasoned organization like this, when it prioritizes its actions for the coming year or two, it puts IVG at the top. Yes, they will talk about time limits on maintaining embryos in culture. They will discuss womb replacement. They'll discuss preconception screening, whole genome sequencing of embryos and fetuses, genome editing of gametes and embryos, and egg freezing. But at the top of the list, they place IVG. So let's delve into it a little bit more deeply and see what we can learn. I don't think anybody in this room needs to be convinced that this is a disruptive technology. It will change the way we do things. The question is it achievable in the human? And as we speak today, I have to say, we still want to put a question mark at the end, although we're close. We're not quite there. And knowing what I know about the people involved, I somehow have very little doubt that it's just a question of time. And so the timeline, uncertain, but at one point, individuals like yourselves, who are undoubtedly the appropriate age range, will probably see to the realization of IVG. Now, I said at the very beginning that none of this would be possible without stem cells, because a stem cell is a cell you can take anywhere. But the question is, how do you create those cells? Well, there are two technologies, only one of which survives. But back in 1958, so-called somatic cell nuclear transfer technology was introduced. And John Gardner from Cambridge University, using a somewhat evolved technique, which entailed the injection of a somatic nucleus into a nucleated oocyte, gave rise to a sequence of manipulations to a zygote blastocyst in the cell mass from which he derived what we call today embryonic stem cell. As a practical matter, we don't really use embryonic stem cells anymore, and I'll explain that in just a minute. More recently, in 2006, the so-called induction technology was introduced by Shinya Yamanaka, MD, PhD, also from Kyoto University, who began his technique with a somatic cell, say a skin cell, transfected that cell with select transcription factors, and voila, he ended up with what we call induced pluripotent stem cells. These are really the stem cells that are currently being used in every laboratory that is engaged in this arena or related arena, simply because of its reliability and simplicity. Nevertheless, both individuals received the 2012 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. So back to in vitro gametogenesis. The process is like this. You start with a somatic cell, say a skin cell. You convert it to either an embryonic or induced pluripotent stem cell. But as I mentioned, most commonly it will be an induced pluripotent stem cell. And then you'll guide that stem cell towards a gametogenic fate. Now you could guide it, as I said, to any other fate. But if you know the recipe, you could, in principle, direct that stem cell towards a gametogenic fate. What are the prerequisites of such a process, if you will? Well, you need to know what we call the germ cell specification pathway. You need to apply 7 cues. You need to know what they are. You need to know the sequence by which you apply them, the timing thereof. And you always need to take into account, in the case of gametes, the so-called niche, which is to say, the granulosa and theca cells in the context of the oocyte, and the Sertoli cells in the context of the sperm. Eggs do not develop properly in the absence of granulosa and theca cells, and sperm do not develop properly in the absence of Sertoli cells. And so the so-called niche, the surrounding cells, need to be taken into account in the process. The beginning was very modest and dates back perhaps to 2003, when Hans Scholler, who was then a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania, published a paper in Science titled Derivation of Oocytes from Mouse Embryonic Stem Cells. Dr. Scholler has since gone back to Germany and is the director of the Max Planck Institute for Molecular Biomedicine. At the right lower hand corner of the slide, you can see the so-called oocyte that he, at the time, attempted to produce. That same year, Toshiaki Noche, on the basis of the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, also converted embryonic stem cells to germ cells in vitro. George Daly, who presently is the Dean of Harvard Medical School, back in 2004, published a paper in Nature titled Derivation of Embryonic Germ Cells and Male Gametes from Embryonic Stem Cells. And René Rey-Opera, who at the time was at UCSF, published a similar paper. As we went through the years, in this case, the first 10 years of this century, and later on, the 2nd century, we increasingly noted powerful papers in journals such as Nature, Cell, and the like that deal with the notion of in vitro gametogenesis. And so when you get to 2015, the state of the art was that the germ cell specification pathway, we concluded at the time, was not conserved between the rodent and the human, which is to say, just because you could do it in the rodent did not mean you could do it in the human. And what's more, the genetic networks involved were quite distinct as well. So where we stood, if you will, in terms of the state of the art in 2015, we could take stem cells, embryonic or induced, convert them to what is known as primordial germ cell-like cell, the earliest cell in the sequence. But we could not take that cell all the way to a haploid post-meiotic mature gamete. In a word, we mastered the extragonadal component, but we had yet to master the intragonadal counterpart. And so the final frontier was still ahead of us, and still is to some degree, although in vitro gametogenesis all the way has now been accomplished in the rodent, but not quite in the human. In the rodent, our old friend, Katsui Kobayashi, published in 2016 a paper in Nature titled Reconstitution in vitro of the entire cycle of the mouse female germline. And so in the rodent, he could take pluripotent stem cells, convert them to primordial germ cell-like cells, combine them with somatic cells, and voila, create primary oocytes, M2 oocytes, fertilize those, give rise to blastocysts, and ultimately to pups. In other words, in the female germline, we can now recreate the process and start with a stem cell and end up with pups. Of course, that's exactly what you want to accomplish in a human, but we're not there yet. Some of the same was accomplished in the male, in this case by Mitinori Saito, who started with embryonic stem cells and ended up with round spermatid-like cells. But the human is a harder nut to crack. And so we're nowhere near the same human. Professor Saito made a go at it and published a paper in Science on the generation of human oogonia from induced pluripotent stem cells. I emphasize oogonia as opposed to oocytes. In other words, he was able to take human primordial germ cell-like cells, combine them with somatic cells, and using his technology, give rise to oogonia. But he did not generate so-called M2 oocytes, which is really what we need for functionality. So human in vitro gametogenesis, which will give rise to M2 oocytes and mature spermatozoa with fertilizing capabilities, is yet to be achieved. But I think you can all see that given the strength of the investigators and the progress they made thus far, in my mind, it's just a matter of time before we reach the holy land. Now, once we do, there's all kinds of goodies in store. And the scientific and translational progress is substantial. From the point of view of advancing science, you will now have an inexhaustible supply of germ cells to work with. You could say that as far, definitely not for the human. You could perform what the scientists call non-mutant analysis or functional non-mutant analysis, which is to say, knock out one gene at a time and ask what happens. And in so doing, try to delineate the function of that particular gene. You could do that if you had the appropriate oocytes or sperm cells. And you could, for the first time, meaningfully in the human, study germ-somatic cell interactions, which you really are hard-pressed to do today with what technologies we have. More importantly, perhaps, on the clinical end of things, we might be in a position for the first time to reverse germ cell failure. By that I mean, we could provide gamete replacement to individuals who lack them for one reason or another, or might have gametes that for one reason or another have been injured or to begin with have not been functional. You could even gene edit those gametes in case that was deemed useful and helpful in some cases. And for the first time in human history, we are going to witness same-sex genetic parenthood. That's a separate lecture I give, but today, and it's already been published in Nature and elsewhere, given certain modifications of IVG, we can now expect the evolution in time of genetic parenthood by same-sex couples. This is, of course, a sea change for those of us who grew on the knees of Adam and Eve. And we still, primarily, 90% of the time, still focus on Adam and Eve. But the very fact is that time is a changing in your lifetime, at which point both the medical, ethical, and other principles associated with reproduction would have to be adjusted to accommodate same-sex parenting. Now, one of the more immediate effects of IVG, once it becomes workable at that point, it will change IVF as we know it. For example, it will eliminate the need in stimulation and in egg retrieval. Instead of stimulating women with gonadotropins and subjecting them to a surgical procedure of retrieving oocytes, we could avoid all of that by creating eggs in vitro, for example, from a skin cell. So the process will be far less uncomfortable, far less protracted, far less demanding. Of course, it will take, for all of us, convincing that we are doing the right thing and that IVG is as good as IVF, which is obviously very important to remember. To also do away with gamete donation. I don't have to tell you that we currently maintain and pay dearly to egg banks, to sperm banks that are designed to replace or substitute for missing gametes in individuals so affected. Those banks will be rendered redundant once we can reliably produce gametes from stem cells or from somatic cells. And for the most part, IVF, while still requiring some in vivo manipulation or involvement, it will convert IVF primarily to a laboratory procedure. Much of the IVF process that now happens in vivo will happen in vitro in the lab. Yes, we will still require endometrial preparation. And yes, we will need to transfer that embryo. those things cannot be changed and cannot be skipped over. But anything prior to that could potentially foreshorten the process and simplify it for the thousands of women in the United States anyway, who are undergoing IVF every day. In theory, and I emphasize in theory, this could improve affordability and perhaps access. As you know, not everybody can do IVF these days. First of all, you have to be insured by a commercial company. Medicaid will not do. And even then, you need to be in a position to cover some expenses. Having lived in the United States now for 50 years, I've observed the uncanny ability of Americans to jack up the prices of it. And despite the promise and the logic, even though I'd like to be right, I wonder if IVF really will be rendered more affordable and more accessible. It should, but we'll have to see. This is a land of opportunity and a few other things, and we will have to wait and see. Needless to say, none of this can or should happen without oversight and specifically regulation by the FDA. IVG, when it is good and ready, will fall under the jurisdiction of the FDA, specifically the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, abbreviated CBER. And in their own legal, they will be treating IVG under the category of HCTPs, or human cells, tissues, and products. It is unfortunate that I have to mention that the person entrusted with this job, Peter Marks, MD, PhD, Harvard trained, who has been at this job forever, was just asked to resign by the administration and is no longer working with the FDA. He brought invaluable experience to this job, not just experience, care, love, and attention. I happen to know him personally very well. I called him the other day to see how he's faring under the new circumstances. But this is one of the byproducts of what is transpiring all around us. Now, I mentioned early on that Japan is in the lead. And you and me and anybody else would be well within our right to ask, why aren't we doing more in this arena? And when we say do more, we generally mean NIH-funded research, although in theory, if you add the private funds to underwrite this research, you could in principle proceed. But you cannot use the NIH because of an amendment that was passed in 1996, which prohibits the NIH from supporting any project that concerns embryo research. This rider is attached to the annual budget year in and year out, and is still very much in force. And the NIH is prohibited from funding any embryo-related research. Yes, you could support this with privately funded funds and produce gametes to order. And in that respect, I will make a brief mention of the commercial sector, which has now moved into this arena and has taken IVG under its wings. There are two companies out there that are now working on this possibility. Gamito a New York State-based company, is one of them. And as you can see from the title, they have been granted by the FDA IND clearance for what would be phase 3 clinical trials of their stem cell derived gametes. In addition, although we know less about it, there's a company knows a Conception, which likewise is working, quote, on stem cell technology called in vitro gametogenesis that could give families the opportunity to still have children at much older ages, eliminate barriers for couples, etc. End quote. So there are two companies in the for-profit sector that have discovered IVG, that are working on IVG, are not in any way constrained as the NIH is. And the likelihood is IVG is to become a reality for you and me. It will likely be a commercially derived product. The implications for pricing and the like, I leave to your imagination, but these companies are not doing it for any reason other than to please their shareholders. So stay tuned. This is a story in motion. Only time will tell where it heads and where it ends. But it can't be ignored anymore, which is why I chose it as a topic to discuss today. Yes, we could have talked about IVF and all kinds of recent modifications, but considering the average age in this room, I thought you needed to hear about IVG. So thank you very much for your attention, for the opportunity to visit my alma mater, to meet Harold Michaelowitz again, and to just enjoy the moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Any questions?
I just want to thank you for a magnificent presentation here. You know, a subject that I would think in many other institutions we have no idea about. You know, it's quite a shock to hear about it the first time, but I'm so glad that Eli was able to present it here. And I don't think that we all recognize the fact that, you know, Eli was originally from Israel, and George Mitchell had incredible foresight in terms of how he recruited people. And recruited people that were Americans, but he also recruited people from all over the world. He's one of the first programs in the country that had females. You probably don't realize this, but at the time, there were almost no females in the OBGYN field. Hard to believe. We had people that there was a racial diversity that was so unusual, and it just shows you how it was interesting to bring people from different areas together and create such a wonderful presentation today. And so we all should remember George Mitchell, and we're really his product, and that should live on forever. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for this invitation.
I'm wondering where you think we're heading, given the current climate and funding is being cut and everything is politically motivated now.
Good question. I can answer only in part. I already noted that what if in 1996 arrested the NIH and prevented it from funding research. It's only going to be amplified. As you know, on the surface, an executive order was issued by the president in support of IVF. However, if you read the fine points, it's not all that it's it looks to be. We live in an era where life pro-choice is very dominant. Conservatism rules the day. And so, from the point of view of governmental support, I would say the odds of this progressing from a developmental point of view are likely limited and probably reliant on the private sector. However, private sector or not, sooner or later you have to get through the FDA. And the shot across the bow that we just witnessed may or may not signify the future. To say that I'm clear on all the initiatives that are underway, some of which seem to be contradictory, self-contradictory, or mutually contradictory. I find it difficult to answer your question. I think we live in unusual times. And the precise conclusion thereof, I think, is also somewhat muddy. So I wish I could say otherwise, but I think it would be sleepwalking if we did.
Are they working on any other animals other than rodents?
Good question. Are there other animals which are worked on other than rodents? I don't really think so, Hal, or at least nothing comes to mind. That's not to say it's infeasible or unworkable or desirable, but as a matter of practice today, the only people who do this work are in Japan. They work with rodents. They have dealing knowledge with primates, but never really took it very far. So there is the Japanese individuals who, in their environment, are unconstrained, politically or otherwise. And then you have the for-profit industry in the United States, which doesn't depend on the NIH, and can, in principle, move us forward. Where they could run into issues will be at the regulatory level. Because who they will meet when they come to the FDA, I don't know. And will the FDA be receptive, accommodating, etc.? Only time will tell. From the point of view that the current administration is pro-fertility, if you will, you might argue that IVG is in the right place. But I don't want to jump to any conclusions at this point. Time will tell.
I'm wondering where Canada is on research and their development, and whether it's possible for the private sector to move there, or another country that's more friendly, just to keep the process going.
Point well taken, but to my knowledge, nothing consequential is happening in Canada. Of course, this is a big world. We have Europe, South America. But as of today, it really seems that IVG is purely a Japanese asset, plus an asset of some private American companies. IVG really has not spread. And you could ask the question, and you'd be right to do so, why? Not sure I know the answer. Please.
Thank you for the talk. I just have a question for same-sex parenthood. Do you see us one day being able to fertilize 2 eggs and possibly 2 sperms, although there's no mitochondrion there? or will be heading to only generating one sperm from a partner, no matter their biological sex, and then sent from another, and actually going on with IVF?
A good question. And I really recommend that you scan Nature this year. The lead author was Katsuhiko Hayashi, who we discussed today. And although he is using rodents, he was able to render two rodents of the same sex by changing their chromosomal makeup into a fertile couple, if you will, and give rise to pups. Now that's the only paper out there, but anybody who can see the writing on the wall, it doesn't cover their eyes, I think needs to face up to the possibility that your future is likely to involve same-sex reproduction. When, how, of course I can't say, but the feasibility has been demonstrated in the rodent. And when we noted that, we have written now several articles, I think, on this subject, because, like yourself, we were appropriately stunned, appropriately surprised. I mean, none of this was ever brought up in my lifetime. But courtesy of IVG and some of the modifications thereof, this is likely to become part of our future. When, how, we'll see. But there's no denying the desire of same-sex couples, rather than adopt, be the genetic parents of the children. I'm very friendly with many same-sex couples who at the present time have to be satisfied with adoption. But in time, I predict a generation or two from now, this will be simply a matter of fact, and the children that you will be the parents of will grow in a world, or will mature in a world where this is the reality.
Any question? Mary, does anything on the chat? This audience? Is there questions at all? Thank you so much.